Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's session, KevOps for Azure Synapse Analytics. This session is technically a 0-slide session today because I'm basically using a Power BI report instead of PowerPoint slides for a few reasons. For a start, for various reasons, including the fact that obviously, it's a bit of variety for the majority of you. I'm sure you've all seen quite a few different sessions with PowerPoint slides in the day. And also for the fact that obviously one of the main reasons for Power BI is to tell a story. And that's what I want to do in this session. And the final reason is because obviously Power BI is quite integrated with Azure Synapse, and I do know that a lot of people that use Azure Synapse also happen to use Power BI as well. Anyway, just to manage expectations for this session, today we'll quickly cover my bio, brief introduction about Azure DevOps, then we'll cover Synapse Studio objects that are stored in Azure repos. We'll discuss how to migrate Azure Data Factory pipelines to Azure Synapse. Then we'll talk about CICD for both dedicated and serverless SQL pools. And then finally, we will discuss using Azure DevOps to test DataFlows. So a bit about myself before we get started. My name is Chant. I'm a lead BI and analytics architect living in the Netherlands. However, as some of you might be able to tell from the accent, I'm originally from the southwest of the UK. However, I live in the Netherlands due to the fact my wife is Dutch. So basically, I'm an Englishman with some Welsh family, living in the Netherlands, working for a French-based company because he met a woman in Australia. Now, I've worked in IT since the days of Windows 95, and that's probably as much as I should say about that. I have experience in various sectors, including the banking, oil and health insurance industries, and I have various certifications, including being a Microsoft Certified DevOps Engineer Expert and a Microsoft Certified Azure Data Engineering Associate, both of which are fairly relevant for this session. Now, you can contact me a few ways online as well as some other things that you can look at I have available online. I have to admit, I will be mentioning my blog and my GitHub a couple of times during this session. Luckily, because we're using Teams today, I can actually put the links to both of those in the chat to save you having to go through and look for lots and lots of different links. So with that all in mind, let's begin. So very quick introduction to Azure DevOps. What is it? Well, it's certainly a lot more than what I can show you on this screen here. It's basically a collection of services that you can use to manage your application lifecycle management, or to say it another way, how you all collaborate together to do development. It comes with a standard set of services by default, which you can see mentioned here on this screen. However, as well as being able to mention them on the screen, I can actually show you them as well. So this is how Azure DevOps looks when you go into it. And there's actually two versions of Azure DevOps that you can use. There's Azure DevOps Cloud Services, which is hosted in the cloud. And there's Azure DevOps Server. It's just a version that you can install on premises. And it's basically the new name for Team Foundation Server. However, they both look and feel pretty much the same, and they use the same set of default services that we'll be covering in this session as well. So when you first go into Azure DevOps, you can view various organizations and you can view some settings. And as you can see here, you can access various projects as well, if you have the right permissions, of course. And these projects are just logical boundaries for managing work, and they could be, for example, a team or an entire department. So if I click on this particular project, you can see all the default services that were just mentioned on that Power BI report on the left-hand side. So you have Azure Boards for managing your work items, Azure Repos for managing your repositories. I could probably say Git repositories at this point. However, it does support Team Foundation version control repositories as well, if required. Then you have pipelines, and these basically manage your builds and releases, or in other words, your deployments, and these can be both automated and manual. talk about those a bit more in the session. Then you've got Azure Test Plans, which will manage your test plans, and then Azure Artifacts as well. And whichever version of Azure DevOps you use, you have some other things you can use in the overview section, like the summary, dashboards, analytics views, so you can present data sets to Power BI effectively, and a wiki as well. So that is the quick introduction to Azure DevOps for you. If you want to read a slightly longer introduction, I actually had a white paper published the other week, so I will put a link into the chat so you can read that as well if you want to after this session. And apparently I spelled introduction wrong in that part, but there you go. So that is your very, very quick introduction. So just to highlight as well, during this session, I mentioned a few terms which may be a bit of an unknown to some of you. So I would be mentioning about Synapse Studio, and you can access that by going and clicking on the Workspace web URL in the overview section of your Synapse Workspace installation in the Azure portal. You can find the endpoints that you need on the right-hand side in the same overview screen as well. And I'll be mentioning both of these endpoints during this session as well. So that's why I wanted to show all of these here. So, Synapse Studio objects. Certain objects that you create in Synapse Studio can be stored in Azure repos within Azure DevOps. So for example, various objects like SQL scripts, any notebooks you create, etc., they can be stored in a repository which you can navigate to up here. And you can navigate to the different branches apart from one which we're going to talk about in a minute. And you manage that in the Git configuration at the bottom here. And as you can see, you can have what's known as a root folder as well, so you don't have to have all these objects stored right directly in the root of your Azure repos repository. And I can show you how it looks now. So if we go into Azure repos, I have a repository, and this is the same repository you just saw in the Git configuration. And as I mentioned, it's in a subfolder, and in there, the right branch here. So if you go to the right branch, for example, the collaboration branch, and you expand, then you can view the subfolders for all the different objects that you create in that particular branch in Synapse Studio. And in addition to that as well, and I'm not going to delve too deep into this because I appreciate it's been covered in a couple of previous editions of Data Toboggan, you can of course switch to live mode and publish your objects directly to your service in Azure. And once you have done that, those objects go off to the branch you can actually select here, the Workspace Publish branch. By the way, if anybody is having problems seeing anything, I can always increase the resolution, so feel free to put in the chat. So, and I will, if we go to the Workspace Publish branch here, you can see, yeah, it basically puts everything inside one big JSON file, and also a template, another JSON file for the parameters involved as well. And you can actually deploy directly from these to a separate Azure Synapse Analytics workspace. I will quickly show you the official way that's documented for doing this, and this is using the releases feature in Azure Pipelines, which gives you a GUI way of building out what you want to do. So here you point it to your Git repository, which has that Workspace Publish folder in. And then from there, you can create different jobs to deploy in different stages. So here in a GUI-based layout, you can specify that you want that contents of that JSON file deployed to another Azure Synapse Analytics workspace. And to do this, you need a particular extension installed, which is called the Synapse Workspace Deployment extension. And I'm not going to go into this one. Like I said, I am fully aware of the fact that this was actually gone through in the last couple of data toboggans, so feel free to go back through those for a lot more information about setting this up. So that is how all your objects can be stored in Git configuration from Synapse Studio. Obviously, only certain objects, mostly the development objects, and some other things like linked services as well. Not the contents. The contents of your Spark and SQL pools do not appear in the same repository. They are handled differently. We'll discuss the SQL pool side of it very shortly. So, moving forwards from there, and I know that some people have been quite keen to talk about this topic recently. There are obviously a lot of people at the moment looking to migrate their Azure Data Factory pipelines to Azure Synapse Analytics for various reasons. One of the more popular reasons is they want to consolidate from various Azure Data Factory installations into one Azure Synapse Analytics workspace. And there's a couple of ways that you can do this. And I'm going to show you how it looks first. So if we go to Azure Data Factory installation I've already got, you can see I've got Git configuration set up on here as well. And that repository is actually here in Azure DevOps. So here is the Git repository. And just like I showed you in Synapse just now, it also has a root folder structure set up. And what you may not realize is that the structures are pretty much identical. So in reality, what you can do if you want is just copy the individual files from each of these different subfolders directly into your Azure Synapse Analytics Workspace Git repository to have them available. And in addition to that, obviously you can copy and paste the text directly as well if you want to, and it will just work. Believe me, I have tested this myself. I've copied the text over into files of the same names and it works fine. So here, for example, I can show you I have a pipeline here and a data flow in place. And what I can actually do here is actually put a bit of text in here and save this now, and this will save it to my Git repository. And this will help me highlight another thing, because if I go into here at the moment, you would not be able to see this at all yet. So basically, so far I've saved a change, and that change will be reflected in my local Git repository here. So if I go back up to the root folder, you can see I've got a just now update. What that I have set up to do as well, I've actually set it up to initiate a YAML pipeline. And what this YAML pipeline does, I will remove the assistant for this case. I know that obviously some people are fairly new to YAML, and we will talk about both methods for deployments in a minute as well. This is the other way that you can do deployments in Azure DevOps, so using code instead. So what this YAML file does effectively, it checks out, first of all, it checks out the repository that the Azure Data Factory detail objects are stored in. And it also checks out one of the branches involved in the Git repository for the Synapse workspace. So basically this branch here. And what it means by checking out, it clones or copies the repository that's in Azure repos onto the particular agent that will be doing the work. So it copies it locally. And then from there, it runs some PowerShell, and it basically copies all the objects to the same folders from the Azure Data Factory repository to the same folders in the Azure Synapse repository locally on that agent, with a few exclusions, because you don't want to copy over, for example, the default workspace settings. After it's done the copying, this piece of PowerShell navigates to the repository of the Synapse workspace Git repository. It then commits the changes. So basically, it adds all of those files to the Git repository for good. hardens the changes, and then it pushes those changes from the local repository that's on the agent back up to the repository on GitHub. So as you will recall, I made the change just now and I added take 2 to the end of here. So I have to select the migration branch because, as you probably noticed, I set it to synchronize with the migration branch. And from here, if I go up to here, you can see that my updated text has been copied across to here. And this copies across the entire thing, all of the pipeline, the data sets, everything. And I actually published a post about this earlier this week, the automated method. So feel free to go on there and have a look. And that is how you can do the migration of Azure Data Factory objects over. Now, I'm sure most of you realize this. If you do have any questions, feel free to put it into the chat and I will answer as best as I can. So let's look at how to do CICD for dedicated SQL pools. And effectively, you can use the same DATPAC method as some of you may have used for SQL Server in the past. So basically, you can create a database project, which I can show you very quickly how you can do now. I use, for example, Azure Data Studio, and I go to Explore. In fact, I want to actually connect here directly, so I can navigate to a database or a database in a SQL pool. And what I do is if I've got a SQL database project extension, right click and select create project from database, and that will create a database project for me in Azure Data Studio. Now you do need an extension to do this called SQL Database Projects. I'm not going to go into the creation in too much detail because I actually did a session for this last week for an event called Data Minutes. So you're more than welcome to watch that session for more details on how to manage all of that. One point I will mention though is that if you are going to do this to deploy to a dedicated SQL pool, you need to change the target platform to be Azure SQL Data Warehouse. So effectively, once you've got a copy of the database project in Azure repos and it's synchronized with a local copy on your machine, you can do things like this. So I can change a piece of code here and save this to show you how this can be achieved. As you can see, it changed color, so I can just go and harden that change to the Git repository locally. And once it's done locally, just synchronize it in Azure with the repository that's in Azure repos within Azure DevOps. So now we can go into Azure DevOps again and we can see what happened here. So first of all, as you can see here, I've had an update done to the repository. Once this repository has been updated, there are two separate methods I can look, well, more than two separate methods, but there are two very popular methods I can look to use to deploy using Azure DevOps. One is by using what's known as a classic editor. So if you go into new pipeline and scroll down, you can see there's an option to use the classic editor. And what this allows you to do is create your artifacts. So basically, in this case, create your DATPACs using a GUI-based method. And this is actually how you used to do it originally in Azure DevOps when it was first available. If I expand here, pipelines here, underneath pipelines, was actually called builds and used to go straight to this GUI option. And you can still do this. And I know this is popular with a lot of people who are not interested at all in YAML. And then once you have done that pipeline, so I can click on here, you can see that it will create an artifact, which I can drill down into. And then what I can do is use the releases feature in Azure DevOps to actually, in a GUI-based way, plan out and actually state how I want the deployment of that DATPAC to be done. So basically, you first of all point to where the DATPAC is, And then you can have one or more stages to do these deployments. And you do this by adding tasks in a sequential order, as you can see here. And whilst we're here, I'll very quickly show you, if you ever need to migrate this to a YAML pipeline, you can actually click the view YAML here and it will come up so you can copy and paste it. But again, I know this method is still popular with a lot of people because a lot of people have not got the time to learn the YAML is the best way to put it. So the other method, as you've probably guessed, is that you can use a YAML file instead. And I've actually got one set up here. So if I click on edit here, you will see a big YAML file appear. And yes, it does mean that you do have to learn how to put in YAML to declare to do your deployments, because it's basically infrastructure as code. The good thing about it is that this YAML file then gets saved, as you can see here, in your Git repository as well. So if you have to migrate your Git repository for some reason, that YAML file will move with it. And you do have an assistant here as well, because obviously Microsoft understand that this can be a bit people who are new to it. So for example, you can fill out details here, click on add, and that will populate the YAML for you in this file. Now, I'll just give you a quick rundown of what this particular one does, because there's something else I want to cover in this YAML file. So I use here, and I can make this a bit bigger, something called a variable group. And if I open up the library feature here, you can see I've actually got 2 variable groups created. And these are quite useful because you can just group common variables you use in multiple pipelines together. And then you can just declare them in various pipelines. So I've done that in this particular pipeline, and this one is set to do the automatic CICD. So I set the trigger here to be when there's updates done to the main branch. And effectively, where I showed you just now that the classic editor did the build and then the release actually did the deployment, in this YAML file, I'm doing both. And that's the other good thing about using the YAML pipeline, is that you can manage your builds and releases in one file instead. So this is pretty much the code representation of what I showed you all just now. And just to highlight that, we can go back into one of the successful deployments. And you can see that there was indeed a DAP. So anyway, back to here. And as you can see, that column change is now in the dedicated SQL pool. So that is very quickly how you can do your CICD for a dedicated SQL pool, pretty much the same way as you can do it for SQL Server, just a couple of changes. Now, where things get really interesting, obviously these couple of points that I mentioned earlier, and use the SQL endpoint as the server name. So where things get interesting is when you look to do it for serverless SQL pools, as our moderator can tell you, because there's been quite a few discussions about this with people online since Azure Synapse was released and the serverless pools were made available. So the bottom line is that you cannot use the DAP method at the moment for serverless SQL pools. So you have to think of an alternative way instead. And I found a migration-based way of doing it using something called DBUp, which is a .NET assembly that's available online, as you can see here. And what this allows you to do basically is go through, you can put your scripts in a sequential order, and then you can run DBUp and it will deploy them one at a time. And this works really, really well, and you can actually use this with SQL Server as well. However, when it comes to using it for Synapse serverless pools, you're going to have to make a few changes because there are a few things to consider. However, if you reference DBUp directly in Azure DevOps pipeline, you will find that your pipeline can get very complicated and very full quite fast. So an easier way to do your deployments using DBUp is to actually use the DBOps PowerShell module, which uses DBUp behind the scenes. This is available for anybody to use, and it's in a GitHub organization called DataPlat. Now, for those of you who aren't aware, DataPlat is effectively the new name for the SQL collaborative organization that used to be available. Well, it's obviously still available, where you can find DBA tools, DBA checks, etc. So the question some of you may be asking is, how does this look in Azure DevOps? So here is the repository for the serverless pool in Azure DevOps, and I've actually synced this repository with Studio code. So this is how the same repository that you see in Azure DevOps looks here, and you can see the scripts in sequential order. So, well, one thing to take into consideration is that in a serverless SQL pool, you cannot automatically create the schema version database that's required for DBUp. And that's what DBUp logs use to log which part of the scripts are you're at. So you effectively at this moment in time have to redeploy your scripts, or all of your scripts, every time you run it in Azure DevOps, which is why you'll notice I've put in some defensive logic here. So basically with sys statements, and what I can actually do here, I will put in the update for this so we can see this. So what I'm effectively going to do here is create another table called data toboggan tests. I should actually, more graceful way to do this, let's keep the original one, because then it shows a better way to do this to make sense for all of you. So let's copy that. Now, in fact, let's copy the whole thing and paste there to create a new file. So that's the copy. So we'll rename that now to get rid of the copy at the end. I'm just doing this just to show you all how this can be done in a sequential order. And we're going to just put in the word new at the end of all this. So we're going to be creating in a serverless SQL pool, which exists here. So you can see at the moment, I've got one external table. What I'm going to do, so I've just created script 3, I'm just going to save this file. Source control will recognize that. I'm just going to put file here, pardon the change, and then Visual Studio Code very nicely offers me to sync the changes with a big blue button. So I'm just going to do that. And we shall see if the demo gods are on my side for this particular one as well. So as you can see, it's performed an update. And from there, it's actually firing up a pipeline I've created, a YAML pipeline. So if we go back in there here, like you can go down here, as you can see, it just goes through, it checks if the PowerShell, DBOps PowerShell module is involved. If it's not, it installs it onto the agent and then sets the module up ready for use. And then from there, it runs some PowerShell. And that PowerShell basically runs a DBOps commandlet to do the deployment of the scripts onto the serverless SQL pool in sequential order. Now, if I scroll over towards the end, I did mention there is no login. So you have to set the schema version parameter to be null, and that basically tells the PowerShell module not to work with the schema version table. Now, as you can see, that's just completed. So I can now hit refresh and my new tables have appeared. So as you can imagine, this is very useful, especially if you have, for example, your files in for your serverless SQL pool in data lake storage somewhere, and you want to be able to point to them from multiple Synapse serverless SQL pools, you can use this automated fashion to set it up on your different workspace instances. And as I said earlier, I know it's something our moderator is keen on doing as well. So if we go back to the overview for all of this, there is one very important point I want to make for all of you. Well, 2 points actually. First of all, if we go back to here, I've actually got a public GitHub repository that you can look to clone or download as a zip if you want to. That contains a template for how to do this. So you just go into the subfolder and the templates in there. And in fact, I've also done the same for the dedicated SQL pool as well, because I am aware, yeah, obviously at the beginning when you start working with YAML, it can be a bit daunting. The other important point relating to all of this is however you set up the variable for your password, please make sure that you wrap it in single quotes. So basically these 2 single quotes here, put your password in between. Whether that's a variable you're using directly in the pipeline, or whether it's in a variable group, or if you're pointing it to key fault, please make sure you use those single quotes. Otherwise, you can spend a lot of time troubleshooting why it's not working. I may know this from experience. So, are there any questions about anything related to the dedicated or serverless SQL pools before we move forwards?
I think you're covering off everything that people might want to ask. Actually, Kevin, it's a great session. So just keep going. I think everybody's just in awe of it a little bit.
Well, one thing I will say to everybody, because I know I'm covering a lot today, is that what you might want to do after today is go and find the videos when they're released and watch this one again. Maybe half the speed, or maybe watch it a couple of times. And also as well, so what I will actually do before I go to my final topic, because there was one question that I got asked about during the very first data toboggan, and I thought I might get asked it again today, so I actually put it in here. So yeah, there is a YAML schema reference for people to help people online from Microsoft, and because they've done a lot of development work on it recently, it's actually looks and feels as slightly different from how it was before. So it's actually quite easy to navigate in as well. And this is quite useful. You can find some good tips in here as well, like for example, how to check out just one certain branch of a repository, etc. Anyway, final topic here I want to cover today is testing data flows in Azure DevOps. So we've covered a lot of the technical things to do with deployments today. However, something that does get missed quite a lot, which we should probably do, is the testing side of these things. Now, as some of you are probably aware, yeah, a lot of people use spreadsheets to manage their testing, which is fine. Spreadsheets have been around for quite some time. However, you can get something called a spreadsheet sprawl, as I call it. And that is where you end up with multiple copies of the same spreadsheets in different locations, sometimes even with different file names. So you have to figure out which one is actually the most current version and the correct version, because sometimes the version that's the most current might not be the most correct. However, you can actually manage your test plans manually in Azure DevOps, providing that you have the right licenses. Really good thing called Azure Test Plans. So I like to think of Azure Test Plans basically as semi-structured, because you can have a test plan in Azure Test Plans that contains we have a question in from Richard, just as I was talking about test plans. Okay, I will talk to you all about the structure of this in a minute. I just want to read out Richard's question. Well, you see the question in the chat. Have you any advice on DevOps approaches for data fixes, pre-deployment and post-deployment scripts, and have to adjust the entities as we make the changes? So, is this for dedicated, or is this in relation to dedicated or serverless SQL pools, Richard? Basically.
It's not actually my question, because we've got questions coming. Well, we've got questions coming in on Slack. So Steve Powell asked the question.
Oh, okay.
Says
I should have opened up the Slack on the other screen. Okay then. And you see the questions from Steve Powell.
Yeah.
Steve, since I know Steve, can you contact me afterwards online so you can give me a bit more details about this, if that's okay? And I will then carry on for the rest of this session for everybody, because Steve's connected to me online, so I will go through it with him in detail from there. So that's right. So yeah, anyway, back to Azure test plans. Like I said, I like to think of them as semi-structured, because you have test plans at the top level. Each test plan can have one or more test suites inside them, and then each test suite can contain test cases. However, you can have test cases directly within test plans as well. That's why I like to think of them as semi-structured. Now you have three types of test suites that you can use in Azure test plans. So you have static suites where you just put in the suite entries yourself and you don't look about anything in work items. Then you have requirements-based suite, where basically you query your work items to find certain ones to build the test suites on. And then you have query-based suite, which is a more dynamic way of working with them. And the most popular one that people tend to work with is actually the middle one, the requirements-based suite. And I've actually got set one up here for a demonstration. If you want more details about these various types of suites and what you can do with them, I've got a series of blog posts that talks about them, and it gives examples for various services like Azure Synapse, Azure Data Factory, and Power BI. So feel free to go through and look for those in my blog. So as you can see, I have a test case already here, and I defined it earlier using various steps. So I can just highlight this here, click Run for Web Application. So this loads up a new browser window with my test case inside it based on what I defined. And as you can see, you can actually put images inside here, which is quite useful. So especially when you want to check things like pipelines inside the test case, especially when there's multiple pipelines in different services. So for example, here, check the data flow works, and I can click on a tick if it works, or cross if there's an issue. So for example, say these two are correct, and then I want to check this one, and it didn't work. I just do that, and I can add a comment as well, like it broke. And then from there, I can create a bug. Now, going back to these images, they are very useful for people as well, and obviously you can use it to highlight essential things. For example, as I mentioned earlier, if you're doing an Azure Data Factory pipeline migration from Azure Data Factory to Azure Synapse, you'll probably want to use a separate branch for where the initial pipelines go, just to check they do properly work. So one thing you want to highlight to everybody, for example, in these test cases, is that they have to be in the right branch. And that's why these images are quite useful. And as you can see, there's other things you can do in test plans, like in record, make screenshots, record with audio if you want to as well. And if you're working with other applications as well, like other development style applications, Azure test plans becomes a lot more powerful. Just leave there, and hopefully I'm leaving the right one, because if I expand this out, you can deal with things like configurations, which means configurations of different browsers, etc. And of course, you can view your progress reports and everything from here. So that was a very quick introduction of Azure Test Plans and why I recommend using those in spreaders instead of spreadsheets. So effectively, just like I said on Power BI, goodbye to spreadsheets and hello to Azure Test Plans. So that is everything I'm covering in this session. So I've put my social media details at the bottom of this screen again, in case anybody wants to reach out to me, in particular, of course, Steve Powell, who has his question. And that is it. I'll leave this time for a couple minutes for any questions. All that's left for me to say. Thank you very much for all of the Data Toboggan organisers, and of course, all of you for attending this session.